Let me just say a little bit about Dr. Sive. As I indicated, she is from the Massachusetts Institute of Technology. She is a professor of biology, and I was looking at her start date there, and she's almost going to have been there for 25 years. That's a pretty long time to be in one place, and it's obviously been integrated into the fabric of the university. One of the things that's kind of nice to see is that she's taken on some of an administrative role. She is an associate dean in the School of Science, but she still maintains an active research program looking at the development of vertebrate embryos. And that takes a lot for me to say because I'm a chemist. Anyway, so let's welcome Dr. Sive. You're all mic'd up?
I am.
Outstanding.
Thank you. I was a chemistry double major. I was a zoology chemistry double major, just so.
Yeah. Biochemistry is the only course I ever dropped, so I couldn't get over close to it. So let me start by asking if you would take a few minutes and tell us about your perspective on how it is that MIT came to decide that it should have this kind of conversation about the direction that it was going in.
Sure. I'd like to say thank you for inviting me. Thank you for being here. It's a pleasure. It was a very exciting plane ride. We had to stop and refuel and then get more fuel, and here we are. You know, this is the third task force on the future of education that I've been on at MIT. So periodically, you know, I guess the university decides to re-examine itself and see how we're going. I think one of the things about MIT that makes it very interested in re-examining itself are the general institute requirements. So all of our freshmen have to take the same cohort of classes. They take 2 semesters of physics, 2 semesters of calculus, a semester of chemistry, a semester of biology, and some humanities subjects, and they all have to take this set of classes. And there's a lot of pride and concern about who's teaching and what's being taught that periodically kind of bubbles up and leads to a re-examination of, are we doing these GIRs correctly? So that's one of the reasons that we periodically have these. The task force, though, that we're having now is by far the most interesting of the ones that I've ever sat on, because there's a new player, which is online education, and it's really because of the extraordinary internet and all the things that you can do, and this notion that maybe a good pedagogical tool is the use of online methods that can augment and supplement the teaching that we kind of do traditionally. And this is very interesting because the ramifications of thinking about how online education can really readdress what we're doing on campus and how we can do things off campus in different ways is making it a very rich and full discussion. And I think you've all seen the preliminary report, which I have with me, but it's quite an interesting report, I have to say, and it reflects the interesting discussions that the faculty are having together with some students.
So MIT, at least from somebody looking at it from the outside, as an agent of change, is seen as the kind of place that really promotes the notion of online. So there are the online courses that's made available. There's edX, as an example. So there's a lot of looking outward in terms of how it can integrate with those who don't have the good fortune to become students at MIT. But what about on campus? What's the on-campus perspective of online? How is edX, how have those courses influenced the faculty and the students?
Right, so this is an evolutionary discussion. It's a really interesting question. I would say that the answer is formative. Actually, we have little bits of ideas. I think the easiest thing to think about is that having high quality online material kind of acts like a personal textbook, so that instead of contracting out to McGraw-Hill or Sinau or wherever your textbook is being published by, you as a professor can actually make your own textbook that can then supplement some of the teaching that you're doing and perhaps can change the teaching that you're doing. So that is happening on campus. There's some pre-recorded, if you like, or there's some kind of lecture recorded material with supplementary problems that's acting as kind of a textbook as faculty are teaching. And you've heard of this flipped classroom. Have you heard of this notion of flipping the class? It's terrible, okay? I think it's a terrible notion, and I don't think anyone really likes it, where, the idea is that the students do all the reading before, and they come fully armed with all their knowledge, and they come into your lecture, and, they know it all, and so you can move on to some kind of higher level of discussion with them. And I don't think the students like that, and it doesn't really work. But the sense that you can use pre-recorded material as a personal textbook is quite popular, and the sense that you can use online instant feedback problem sets for students to really give them a sense of whether they got a concept, whether they need to try it again, to give them a second chance to do a similar type of problem for particular modules of problems, that seems to be working better. So we do have subjects which have been flipped, where students are supposed to come in for higher level, hands-on, deep discussions about the material, and then they do their problem sets online with instant feedback, but often in kind of organized communal settings. That's quite rare, though, and it's very mildly popular. And then there is much more where people are trying to use online material to augment their courses. But it's very evolutionary, because most faculty don't have, good quality online material to use right now. And so it's experimental. MITx, which is the on-campus version of online material, educational material, is very experimental. I'm co-chair of the MITx Faculty Advisory Committee, and we're really working with faculty to try to figure out what people are thinking about, how it's going to change the way they would traditionally teach, how much it's going to cost to make that kind of material. And it's really experimental. It's very exciting, because we don't know just yet. So you're here at a really good time to have this conversation.
So to what extent do the students themselves drive a perspective that change is needed? It's interesting you made that comment about what students think about flipped classes. I think that what students think about flipped classes is very much a consequence of how good the teaching in a flipped classroom is. But do they, in fact, have an expectation that they're going to arrive and the technology is going to significantly impact the way they are taught? Has that changed over the last 10, 15 years?
Well, the technology has changed, right? I think a computer is something you put on now. It's like a shirt, a pair of shoes you put on your computer. It's just part of everything. And the students come in with the internet as part of everything. So I think the expectation is that that's going to be part of the teaching, because it's part of the students. And in a way, I feel like we're kind of notching up to that expectation, where that's how the world works now. So the students, what do they expect? I think MIT students come in expecting that they will get a rigorous education, that they will learn how to solve problems of all kinds, because that's what we hammer into them, and that somehow the faculty will guide them in that direction. But beyond that, I think they have a pretty open mind about what they expect when they come on campus.
So as you told me in our conversation, online courses don't happen at MIT right now, and that's understood. Can you imagine moving in that direction, or do you think the students will retain this traditional notion that people sit and talk like this?
Yes, I think they'll retain the traditional notion in some sense, because one of the things, that's come flashing out of the task force, but I'm sure you all know, is that some of the core values of teaching are really, really basic. You sit with a group of people somehow, and you make a connection, human being to human being, and you explain something cool or something that the student doesn't understand, and now you've got them. There's a community of learners, and it's interesting, and you're moving through the material together, and you're challenging students. So I think one of the things that's coming out of the task force, but it's almost intuitive from every teacher, is that losing the human contact is something that just is not even a possibility. And the notion that, we'd switch to online subjects where the student would learn in his or her dorm room and everything would kind of just be put in front in some kind of a science fiction movie kind of way for online education is just not going to happen. But that being said, I think the sense of, how the professor or other teacher-student contact will play out is something quite interesting. And that's, where there's some wiggle room. Are large lecture formats on their way out? I don't think they can ever really be. But superimposed on that, is there a way to let the individual student learn in the individual way that works best for each student?
So this is an interesting point, and I think that for me, when I look at what technology does, is that it allows us to deconstruct this kind of space-time continuum in which we do our teaching, so that I can now look at a student who arrives on the first day of class, an arbitrary first day of class, and ask the question, is it possible, using the teaching tools I have, plus all of the technology available to us, which for example includes all content knowledge available 24/7, to make it possible for every student to be successful. We bring in so many students. It was interesting, your comment about how even at MIT, there are students who come in who don't have the foundation that they need to be successful, and you can't simply leave that human asset behind because you've decided to give a test in 3 weeks and they don't do well on it. So can you talk a bit about your perspective? Because I think you've indicated that this is very much a core notion to you, that idea of being able to promote student success over everything else.
Yeah, I think it's a really interesting question, David. I think that this is something that's there. Again, this is formative. You're in the midst of a formative thought process here. But the sense is, and it's quite clear, that students come in all smart, but with different kinds of abilities and with different levels of background. I teach introductory biology, and some of my students come in, they haven't had a biology class since they were in middle school, if they're international, since they were in elementary school, and some of them, have got AP Bio and a 5, and they've been working 3 summers in research labs at the NIH, and they have a first author paper already, and it's like they're all in the same class. So how do you make sure that they all do okay? And then, there are the different kinds of learners, the ones who actually do much better if you give them a problem and they have to figure out the concepts that are necessary to solve the problem, and the ones who really do much better if someone is sitting explaining the concepts and giving some feedback. And so there's a direct kind of teacher-student interaction. And the question about not leaving people behind is exactly that. Can you capture the different levels of background and the different learning styles that work best for each student so that everyone can be somewhat successful, as successful as we can think to make them, in a way that uses online learning? And I think that that's actually one of the most interesting things to think about with online learning, that you really can capture all these disparate students and levels and abilities and thought processes.
So I teach a 500 student section chemistry course and developed what was in my mind a fairly radical notion that there's no really good reason that my students shouldn't all earn A's. And it wasn't because of the notion of grade inflation that would lead to this. It was realizing that people who walk into my classroom and sit down are smart enough to learn introductory chemistry. It's not like it's out there and they can't do it, but that the things that get in the way of it are very often built on the sorts of things that you can overcome if you can find the right way to teach, if you can individualize the process for each of these individuals. And for example, I think that when I can look at the final exam schedule for my course and see that my final exam is on the last day of final exams, I know for a fact that the average grade on my final will go up a full letter grade because they've had over the weekend to study for it. And I've seen this through 4 cycles of having the last class as opposed to the first one. Well, why should the arbitrariness of when somebody assigns you your final exam schedule have all that kind of difference. Nowadays, and by the way, the reason they can do it is because everything about my course is online. All of my lectures are online, all of the learning content they need is there, and if they need to study really hard for that final exam, they have that extra 4 days. So I think that this is one of the things that's going to be really fascinating, is to imagine how we personalize that kind of learning experience.
Great, that's a great point. There's an interesting experiment that Michael Seema did last semester for a course called 3091, which is solid state chemistry, where the problem sets were all put online. The way the students did the problem sets, though, was not by themselves. They had to actually go somewhere, some place that was open, I don't know, 2 p.m. to 11 p.m. at night every day. And they went in and they had to do some problem from a particular module, and there were a whole bunch of problems. So the students were randomly assigned a problem, they tried it, they instantly got feedback whether they were successful or not. If they weren't successful, they had to go away, and they could leave it there if they wanted, but they had the option of coming back after sort of studying a bit more and then trying another problem that would be randomly assigned. And this was really interesting, because if you looked at how the students did on their problem sets over that semester, where they could come back and try them again and so on, not surprisingly, the level of success skyrocketed, okay? And that's interesting, and the students liked that. They liked having a second chance to really notch up on their problem-solving skills. When it came to the final exam, the notch up wasn't as spectacular, okay? There was a bit of an improvement in the final grade, the average grade, but it wasn't like everyone suddenly got A's in the course. So there was something, you still have to synthesize the material, so at the end of the semester, you still have to take your final exam. And it's perhaps good that not everyone got A's, because, maybe some people mastered the problem sets much quicker than the others. But this notion of, getting to each learner so that each modular section can be mastered and tried again by students as they go through the course. This is something that's quite interesting, both to the students and the faculty.
My favorite visual on the website is one that shows the disaggregation of the university in terms of the experience of the students. So if you get a chance to go, and in fact, I think what I'll do is steal it and cut and paste it and email it to folks, because what it does is it takes the idea of a degree plan, and inside that degree plan are collections of courses that you take, which are broken down into lectures that you take. And sitting over here on the side are some of the non-academic sorts of things, the experiential learning, plus the fact that you live in a dorm and the fact that you engage in different kinds of leadership opportunities. Imagine taking all of those things which have been put together into this whole that we call being at a university, and pull them apart. And now that they're apart, think about how we might reconstruct them in different ways. As you mentioned on the phone when I was talking to you, how that's going to work best hasn't been sorted out. But it does give an opportunity for the president of this university, for example, in conversations I have had, say, Laude kids who want to learn a little bit about geology into a van with the Jackson School, and drive them out to West Texas and spend 3 days out in West Texas and come back having earned 1 credit worth of understanding geology. So what has taken place so far in terms of conversations about how to do something with that disaggregation?
Yeah. So this, gets various names. It's called unbundling and modularity. And the notion, yes, is that the degree can be much more fluid, that people can take bits and pieces on campus, off campus, in lecture, online, over time, maybe a whole year away, and come back and sort of piece it together. And there are a number of different things that are being thought about. So I've been in charge of a group called Modularity, where we've been examining how to break down subjects into chunks, where a module is defined as a learning unit. Maybe it's a lecture, maybe it's 4 lectures, depends if it's an undergraduate or a graduate subject. And that notion that every module can be a learning unit with its own tests associated with it, and that could be a unit of success, that a student can acquire. So that's quite interesting to think about. And you can think about, having modules. We coined the phrase sticky modules, which join together to give you a course, or smooth modules, which kind of stand alone and would be perhaps a one unit all by itself. And then we talked about vertical modules, where you have to take these learning units in defined sequence, or horizontal modules, where you can mix them up and it doesn't really matter which sequence you take them in. The notion there is that you can unbundle the information in a subject. If you're going to actually give credit for the whole course at the end, there has to be some synthesis, as we were discussing. You have to be able to test that the student can aggregate the information in all those modules and put them together. Otherwise, it's not clear if you're giving these little bits, well, it's not clear to many of us, if you're giving little bits of information to the student, little bits of learning, but they really don't add up to the whole. Whereas, your chemistry course or someone's, course in physics or philosophy or something adds up to a whole. So the question with modules is they're very appealing, and there's a lot of push to get modules. You can mix and match them. You can make personalized courses. You can imagine all sorts of fun stuff with modules. But I think one of the challenges is whether the student would come out of a modular course, with a fulminant knowledge. Is there some kind of, synthesis of information? Or would it be a whole bunch of little stuff that didn't quite add together, like, 100 YouTube videos, which is really interesting and fun, but they don't necessarily add up to anything. I think that's one of the challenges we have as educators, really.
So when I was, I guess I feel like that problem has already been solved, and it's called graduate education. And in my experience, so when I ran my research program, I always had a general rule that you knew that you could graduate when you came into my office and started arguing with me. And it's because that meant that even though you'd learned in a very modular way over 4 or 5 years what it is you needed to know, you were able to somehow synthesize that into the ability to stand peer-to-peer with me and talk about the discipline in ways that said, yep, it's time for you to just go. And on a certain level, as we try to distinguish what it is that is a residential campus from an online university, there has to be those pieces of it which we can feel are real. That ability of a student to learn to be a leader, to be an entrepreneur, to innovate, to be able to work in teams, those sorts of intangible things that don't necessarily get credit in terms of content knowledge, and yet we would associate with elite students walking across stage at graduation. So one of the questions being asked is, however you reconstruct it, what can you imagine you would expect from a student walking across stage at graduation? It has to be more than just content knowledge. That's what you have to show off. So I just said a few things. What's your perspective on that?
Yeah, what do we want from our let's talk undergraduates. Graduates are different species. But what do we want from our undergraduates? It's a really interesting question. At MIT, we want our undergraduates to be able to solve problems. They're brought up with problem solving in every field, from biology through, all of their, whatever they take, science majors, engineering majors, humanities, of course, always have a lot of thought associated with them. But the idea is that the students understand the deep notions of problem solving, dissecting a problem, analyzing it, addressing how to solve it, and then solving it. And I think that, that's really the currency at MIT, that our students finish their undergraduate degree knowing how to solve problems across multiple subjects. And the fact is, if you know how to solve problems across multiple subjects, you can usually go solve problems anywhere. And that makes the students quite valuable when they are looking for employment later on, because it's clear that they could probably be given many different kinds of problems and, say, okay, let's start. I know where to start, or I have a sense of where to start. So I think that that currency, you know, that the student can take a problem and start parsing it and solving it, I think that's a really good currency. I think one of the things that our students can't quite do is identify the problems of the world. You know, what's going on in the world that's a problem or not a problem. They want to, and they do quite well. You know, we try to encourage them, but I think this kind of engagement with the world, being a cosmopolitan individual, being a sophisticated global student who really can think about what it is that our world is needing from them, what are the things, both intellectual and practical, that they could go out and solve. I think that's, you know, another currency, that someone comes out of their undergraduate degree sophisticated in a global sense about what's going on in the world. So those are a couple of things. That's probably enough for now, David.
And
yeah.
We're about to put folks to work, as I had asked at the tables, but that's an interesting perspective to have. I think one of the things that separates students today from students 25, 30 years ago is they have a much higher expectation of what they can accomplish while they're undergraduates. Now, we may think they're not quite ready for it, or that they don't quite understand what the big picture is, but they're more than willing to create a startup, or to create a not-for-profit, or to go off to some other part of the world and fix something and come back and tell us that they've solved it. And it's a genuine passion for making a difference in the world. And in many ways, you want them to see that as the reason for being in college, is to be able to develop the skill sets necessarily to go out and do that effectively. They just, in the experience I've had here at UT, they're much more aggressive about wanting that kind of experiential learning. So I guess the last question I have for you before we go to the tables and have people start their conversations is, to what extent does experiential learning look like something that MIT would imagine being part of the degrees that are coming?
It's a very interesting question. We have some already. So we have, you know, research opportunities on campus. We have international research opportunities. We have many public service opportunities that students can partake of over the summers. So, and there are entrepreneurship competitions and centers and so on campus. So there's stuff that students can do outside laboratory courses, outside, you know, the kind of classroomy learning. That's there, but there is certainly a question of, is there more? So, you know, things on the table. We have students, we have a pilot program where students are going out over the summer to set up courses at other universities who might be using MITx online material and customize particular courses for the particular country or the particular university. So our MISTY-X teaching ambassadors or teaching fellows. There's a question of, could our students go out and teach more? And we do have some teaching programs which would be more experiential programs. There's a notion around, should our students have to do a service? Should there be a service requirement for graduation? You know, maybe. I think the students do quite a bit in terms of experiential learning. They go out, they start companies, there's a lot of encouragement, there's a lot of money to help students do so, especially in the engineering and the sciences. That's not true. It's much harder to start a company as a scientist. But they do teaching, they do go out and do internships all over the world and all over the country. So there is that in place. There's a notion of, you know, should we notch up? Should we actually require some of these things? Maybe, maybe not. But, you know, those are the kinds of experiential types of learning that are going on and that we're thinking about.
Well, thank you. What I'd like to do now is give individuals the opportunity at the tables where they're sitting to engage in conversation with those around them. I put pieces of paper out on your table for you to pick up and look at, as I mentioned at the beginning. These are 3-page sheets. They are questions about how our students have changed, how the campus ecosystem has changed, and as a consequence of those changes, how we might imagine what we would expect to see in our students as they graduate from this university. So we're going to take the next half hour. I'm going to go find a table. That's a great table. Those are some fine people there that you might sit with. And just engage in conversation. And feel free while it's going on to write down in whatever way you want the kinds of things that are coming to you. After about a half an hour, we'll reconvene and we'll open the floor for questions. Thank you. So if I could have your attention, in what is always the worst part of a campus conversation, I am bringing the campus conversation down for a while. I would like it if we, as a consequence of the discussions we've been having at our table, start asking questions of our guest and begin the process of thinking a little bit about the sorts of things that we've brought up as we sort of let these things ping back and forth among ourselves. I've seen uneven examples of individuals writing stuff down. The next half hour of question and answer is an opportunity for you to just go ahead and jot down things that have come to mind so that we can collect them as we finish up. We do need to finish up around 4:30, but when that is done in about 25 minutes or so, you can continue here and engage in conversation and finish up your writing. So let's go ahead and get started with the questions that you might have. We have two microphones. There's one there and there's one there. And don't be shy.
This was very stimulating in a lot of ways, but we came up collectively with some concerns. In part, the way that the discussion has been framed in terms of measurable outcomes, aggregate, modularity, currency, and those are terms that may be more functional in the sciences and engineering. However, humanities have different sets of goals for our students when they finish. And in fact, it might be thought of better as anti-modularity, since what we're interested in doing is synthetic work so that we can produce creative, successful human beings who are connected to the rest of society. And we're interested in integration as well as application to the real world outside of them. So I just wanted to leave that there, in addition to which we're also concerned about the kinds of needs that we see that have to do with budgetary concerns, that already as instructors, we have a heavy set of expectations on our time. We're given new programs, applications to be able to keep up with Blackboard, from Blackboard to Canvas, answering emails, building PowerPoint slides, to be able to reach our students in a multiple creative ways. And yet we lack sufficient support or infrastructure for doing this kind of work. So there are further actually questions about not so much enlarging internet use, but support for internet use and as resources for ourselves as teachers as well as for our students.
Okay, thank you. That was, was a really interesting set of comments. I can respond to a couple. I think the humanities are a really interesting challenge in terms of addressing whether there's some role for online education. We've had some, interesting subjects that have been put out in the humanities on MITx. But yeah, can they be broken down or not? I think there's some science subjects that can't be broken down, and the question really is subject by subject, I think. But it's a very interesting discussion, and certainly we have a number of humanities professors. Although MIT is a science and engineering school primarily, we have an extraordinary School of Humanities, Arts, and Social Sciences that is very highly respected, and are included in this conversation. It's very, very important to include the humanities. I think you were asking about how does a faculty member juggle it all? You know, how can you notch up to using the internet in your teaching? No, you weren't asking that. You wanted.
We already do that. So the problem is having easier access to tech support, having materials archived in such a way that we're not constantly having to reinvent the wheel. We already do quite a bit on the internet, so we're not feeling that that's a lack for us.
Yeah. So the question of resources and you know, organization is one that you know, we've been thinking about as well. The resources associated with putting courses out and modules putting them out are variable. They range from very substantial to kind of do it yourself. And the way our Office of Digital Learning, which is the oversight body for the MITx initiative, is working is that, you know, you fill in some kind of a vision statement about what you want to do, and then you give a sense of maybe the budget. If it looks interesting, then you meet with someone and you get some budget from them, and maybe you get some computer support. It's really nascent, so we're sort of feeling our way around, but that's the general idea, that a faculty member has a vision, and then there is infrastructure and there is support to facilitate getting something done. So if you had a particular idea, there would be a sort of a, you know, some school-wide or university-wide mechanism to do it. That's how it would actually work at MIT. What is being done now in terms of organizing the requests for various MITx initiatives is twofold. One, the departments are being asked to have some kind of strategy, a departmental MITx strategy, so that it actually isn't really a free-for-all in faculty members wanting to get particular pieces of online stuff done for themselves, but that whatever anyone does fits into something that the department has decided is a strategy. For example, there might be a series of 4 courses that are considered a series, like an X series, and those would be the ones that there would be resources for. So there's the departmental strategy, and then there's the sort of university oversight level where people can get resources from. How to organize all the material is a real challenge, and this comes up especially in terms of modules. If one thinks about collecting hundreds and hundreds of modules over a period of years, you know, who's going to have oversight for them, where they're going to be, and that's really ongoing. We have something called OpenCourseWare at MIT, which is kind of the parent openware for the university, and that probably will be the place where modules are put, where they would be, you know, cataloged in some good way and then accessible to everybody. But you're absolutely right, there has to be an organizational level. Yeah.
Just a comment. I taught a course called Originality in the Arts and Sciences with Liz Scala in the Department of English, and so I appreciate that on a certain level there may be different ways of thinking about how it is that from the humanities you might want to put things together. But when I think about this disaggregation, I think about it more as an intellectual exercise in which things come apart, but you absolutely have to reassemble them. And I guess my sense is, from what I've seen, that the reassembly that occurs, whether you're reassembling what a science student will be or a humanities student, that there's a lot more in common than you might think in terms of how you think critically and how you experience and how you problem solve. With respect to technology, I think the greatest invention in the world is the document camera, because it allows me to not even need those little plastic sheets anymore. It lets me take a single piece of white paper and put it down and write on it. I use that as a starting point for myself because I love teaching and I want to help my students as much as possible, but if I have to do too much more on a certain level than walk in with those pieces of white paper, then I'm not sure that I'm going to do it. And I think I speak for a lot of faculty who want that kind of effortlessness in what happens. Now, you can incentivize, and we now have, through CTL, about 150 faculty who, within the next year, will have been engaged. There will be a financial incentive that comes in innovation grants, course transformation projects, flipped classrooms, MOOCs, and that brings them on board. But you're right, it's an enormous labor that goes into this for folks that believe that this is something that they're interested in doing, as opposed to something that you do because you have to teach.
Diane Schallert, educational psychology. I can't believe how your question was or your comment was very similar to the comment that I wanted to make. At our table, we also were asking very similar questions about the difference between the humanities and the sciences. But mostly what we focused on was the fact that we weren't accepting the premise of question number 3, which is that we're trying to prepare 21st century leaders. So again, we were echoing very much the comment, and I think I would have passed the microphone except that Josh knows me, and so he couldn't avoid. So one of the things that we said is that we thought that what we're trying to do is how to prepare citizens of the world who are curious, open-minded, but also critical, prepared to listen, open to change, flexible, humble. So these are the kinds of things that we thought we're wanting a curriculum to do, is to prepare people for that kind of future.
Just to comment on that is pretty funny. So I sat with the group who was deciding what to write for that, and we were trying to come up with a word that we hoped would offend no one. And so we ended up with the word leader, and I guess we got that wrong. I'm just kidding.
Carol Delville, nursing, and I'm going to, Diane, little disagreement here. We are preparing leaders. And when we envisioned course change over the university, we see so many commonalities, and we're saying the same thing. We need to be teaching our students outside of the silos together, interprofessionally, so that the chemistry students are communicating with the researchers in the new med school, so that our nurses are learning to communicate with pharmacy and social work. They should be taking those core courses together across professions instead of having our silos of specificity. And I really think that would be an enriching experience to all of our students. One of the best courses I've gotten feedback from is a new course in social work about interprofessional team working, where there's a huge humanities component to it. And the students really learn to change their perspective through that. That's great teaching, it's great learning for them. And we need to find how to cross those courses over on campus.
So a question for you to reframe that. You mentioned some of the core, the idea that you take a physics course, a biology course, a chemistry course, a calculus course. What is MIT doing at that place that finds the interface in terms of creating the interdisciplinary sort of intercalation of ideas?
Yeah, so, a bunch is the short answer. But I think interdisciplinarity, has the danger of being a sort of a catchphrase that sounds good, but maybe is forced and not so substantial. And I think that's the thing that we've been trying to guard against. There's a huge amount of interdisciplinarity at MIT. For example, I'll give you the example of the life sciences. In the life sciences, we have 13 different undergraduate majors that can be life sciences focused. They span through the sciences and the engineerings, in engineering, mechanical engineering, chemical engineering, can be life sciences focused, biological engineering, of course. I could go on. It's a list of 13 of them. They are all interdisciplinary except for biology, which isn't, and maybe brain and cognitive sciences. The others are all interdisciplinary, and they arose naturally because faculty are doing research across disciplines, and then, the courses they taught became interdisciplinary because that's what they're thinking about. So biological chemical engineering, for example, lies in the Department of Chemical Engineering. It's one of the tracks that a chemical engineering major can take, along with straight chemical engineering, and both sets of students come out A-beta accredited engineers, okay? So that is real interdisciplinary stuff that sort of grew out organically almost, although there was a moment that someone decided, let's have this, biology, chemical engineering interface. Some of the things are more constructed. So we just started a couple of years ago a molecular biology, computer science undergraduate major. And it's quite interesting. It takes courses, so these are in 2 different schools. It takes courses from computer science and from biology, and it brings them together in one major. The students get an advisor in each major. It's a great deal for them. And they come out with this kind of computational knowledge that has this deep molecular biology component. And it's very impressive to see how solid and important and useful the knowledge that these students are getting from 2 different disciplines. That came out, I was chair of the undergraduate program in the biology department at the time, and that came out through discussions between biology and electrical engineering and computer science, and we kind of decided to go forward with this particular major because it seemed like a good idea. It took a long time from the initial discussions till the fulminant major, but it's there and it's very popular and very valuable. So I think there's lots of interdisciplinary stuff, and it's a great idea if it works. A great idea if it works, yeah.
So that you bring up an interesting challenge. How do you merge the knowledge base from 2 disparate groups and come up with something that you can still do in 4 years?
That's bigger, yeah, that's a great question. So I'll give you 2 examples, the ones I used. Biological chemical engineering is a packed curriculum. Students do not have any spare time. They do not have one spare unit of classes where they could go and do research, for example, or take an extra music class. They are completely packed in. They're sometimes doing too many subjects per semester. So that's how it works. The same thing is true of the biology, molecular biology, computer science major, but there, rather than in the chemical biological engineering case, it was a big chunk of the biology curriculum and almost all of the chemical engineering curriculum that got mushed together. In the case of the computer science molecular biology curriculum, it was some of each. Okay, and it works better. It works much better. There's a little bit of extra time. The students are not absolutely jam-packed. They do not come out ABET accredited, so they got rid of electrical engineering from the major, so they have computer science, they have molecular biology, part of each curriculum, and then there's a kind of a capstone course that brings everything together to give the student integrated knowledge of what's going on. But it's absolutely a very serious enterprise of education officers in different departments, different schools, sitting down together and realizing, if there's going to be a meaningful interdisciplinary course, something has to go on both ends, and people have to be willing for the something to go. Otherwise, you don't get really anywhere. Yeah.
Hi, I'm Ed Dorn from the LBJ School, and I want to go back to the comment earlier about the 3rd question, how to produce 21st century leaders. And I think it is a very important question. It is one of the questions that universities should think a lot more about. I have a very simple answer to it, which is that if a university desires to produce 21st century leaders, it ought to teach leadership in the same fashion that if a university wishes to produce 21st century engineers, it ought to teach engineering. This is a set of skills, there's an intellectual content to it. I'm not an expert on leadership or on the teaching of leadership, but I will suggest that a university needs to think past what its graduates are going to do in their first job. We are producing specialists. We expect our students to be the smartest kids in the class. We expect them to be the best chemist in the lab. We expect them to be the best musician in the symphony. But we need to prepare our students for that period halfway into the career, perhaps, when they are no longer being hired or evaluated because they're the smartest kid in the class. They are being expected, they are expected to be able to marshal the talents of other smart kids. And that quite often is where people fall flat on their faces, because if you have spent the first half of your career learning how to be the smartest kid in the class or the best chemist in the lab, it is extraordinarily difficult to make that leap toward marshaling the talents of other people. I know that there's a tendency, especially because I've tried to do this, and I know there's a tendency in academic communities to think of leadership as an exercise in which a bunch of martinets march lockstep in a particular direction. Quite the contrary, this is a matter of learning how to get a group of people together to identify a set of goals and to achieve those goals. And I believe very strongly that this university and other universities need to think a lot harder about how to do that.
Yes.
So let me frame this in a provocative way. How are you going to do that when you have a jam-packed interdisciplinary? So biomedical engineering is one of the most desirable new majors on campus.
Yep.
And it is also, I think, pretty close to the largest number of semester credit hours.
Yeah.
And you have to be an exceptional student in many ways to have the discipline to make your way through that in 4 years.
Yeah.
How does that fit with the notion that perhaps you're preparing what is clearly an incredibly talented person to even take that on, to be ready to be a mid-career leader?
I can.
There are ways to do it. There are ways to do that within the context of a classroom. Group projects can get you part of the way there, but you begin by asking yourself the question, which you began with, what do we think our students ought to be able to do? And are we satisfied that we produce students who are going to be terrific in their first job as specialists in one or another area? And I think we should not be.
I think one of the things that is true is that lifelong learning is real, and that when you finish your undergraduate degree, you're not kind of done. There's a lot more to learn. And I think one of the things that our students don't know, and we perhaps don't teach them, is that that is real. That you can go on and you can learn about what you didn't know, and you can learn about how to interface with the world in ways that you didn't know and weren't taught when you were an undergraduate. So certainly, at MIT we have various leadership courses. Some of the students take them, some of them don't. All of the ones who are going to be heads of the undergraduate association or the, DormCon or PanHel, or you've got some of the same organizations here. They all have to actually take a leadership course. How to organize a committee, how to run a meeting, things like this. These are useful things. Leadership as a subject, seems to me that it comes out very well in the Sloan School at MIT, in the business school. I see those students able to stand up and take charge and present themselves and really act like leaders. How do we do it in the rest of the campus? Through extra bits and pieces, certainly not through credit-bearing subjects. Is there time? As David raises, is there time for students to learn leadership in a serious way? Maybe not, maybe in bits and pieces, in small, seminars and so on. But I think the sense that people evolve and that over time, as you leave the university, you haven't actually left, is one of the things that people are very interested in. The faculty are very interested in at MIT, and the task force is thinking about. This notion of once a student, always a member of the community, that you can come back, and this is one of the places online learning might be really quite useful. You can come back and you can learn what you didn't learn on campus. You can be encouraged to take a course at the Sloan School, for example, in how to be a leader, in how to actually organize things. So it's a really interesting question, and your comment's a really interesting one. What can we actually ask of students that's reasonable, that leaves them time to explore and grow and become just the growing young people that they are, while still imparting them with the power and the confidence to go on and become really engaged citizens. Definitely worth thinking about more.
Thank you. I thought they were going to someone else. I'm Lori Holleran-Steiker. Hi. And one of the comments that came up at our table that I think is an interesting frame to put around this discussion to continue upon what, is it Ed? Yeah. Dorn was saying, is sort of a parallel process that goes on at the university between content and process. And that I think that there are some of our classes that are very, very content heavy, and other classes that see the content more as a vehicle for process learning of how to take information, discern good from bad information, be a critical thinker. I'm speaking, this is sort of our mantra in the signature courses that we teach to our students coming in, because we want the best teachers on the entire campus teaching them, but what we're designing it to be is their area of passion and their content expertise is a vehicle for learning how to be a good thinker and how to interact with teams and how to be a good presenter and how to write well and how to discern good from bad information, how to make a mark on your community, how to take what you're learning in the class and bring it outside of the classroom. And so I would think that that would be a mechanism for this movement towards leadership, is to really balance out that content and that process. Because we were talking about how what we remember from college sometimes has to do with the actual information we learned, but more often how we integrated that, how we put it into action in our lives. I'm curious your thought about
Yeah, I think that's a great point. I think any team kind of activity certainly, allows people to take leadership, and certainly our engineering students or anyone who works in a team comes out with some sense of what works, and even more important, what doesn't work. This is a learning experience, and failure is as valuable as success, of course. I think that that's true in terms of entrepreneurship. We have many, many students who go into startups. 90% of them fail, okay? And that is how it is. And you pick yourself up and you dust yourself up and you try again and you fail again and again and again. And out of that comes your one success, maybe one out of 10 tries. From the failure, you learn a lot about how to put things together, which is certainly a leadership skill. And you learn about, how to deal with failure, which is a very important life skill as well. So I do think the whole team activity, intrinsic, there is a bunch of learning about how things work and what success and failure of leading people and guiding people is. Certainly very, very good.
We have reached the conclusion of the time we've allotted. I want to thank all of you for your attendance. I know making your way all the way to the football stadium was quite the thing. You can actually look out and see why they call this the End Zone Club or whatever they call it. And I want to as well thank Dr. Sive for taking the time to fly here from MIT to share her experiences. My willingness to have you all write stuff down is enormous. So to the extent that you can complete some of these forms and get them into us, your comments are very much appreciated. Thanks so much.